It's well known that I have a nose for Danish talent. Funnily enough, when I was a kid, the only thing we knew about Denmark in Britain was that it was famous for producing good bacon. And actually, funnily enough, the commercials, the conceit used to be that you could just smell the bacon anywhere in the house and that you'd go to it and it was so delicious. Actually, even just in smell, that would be attractive because obviously the smell of bacon, I mean, that's people from America are like, what? Because they don't have the same type of bacon. But the type of bacon we have in Britain and in Denmark, it smells amazing when it's cooking in a frying pan. But if you have a nose for Danish talent, I'd go ahead and suggest picking some of them on esports pools. And in fact, when it comes to making bets, obviously Astralis, North, these teams go deep in tournaments. Actually, Heroic is a team on the rise. And over at esports pools, they also have betting. And they, in fact, have a version of the site that's just for betting, esp.bet. And on that site, they have a feature which, as far as I know, no other betting site actually has, which is that you can bet while a match is live. They have tons of different areas in which you can bet on a live match, like who's going to win the first round, or who's going to win the first round of a half, or who's going to get the first kill in a round. It's all sorts of factors you can do. Well, there's lots of different ways you could factor Danish teams in there, because you think of a team like Astralis, pretty good pistol round team, right? They've got good chances to win there. North, funnily enough, have a lot of aim talent, but they actually don't seem to be as crazy on pistol rounds. But they have someone like Config, who in many circumstances, even on CT side, is going to be very aggressive and therefore might get the first kill in a round. You think of Dupree, if it's on a map like Overpass, he runs, they do that boost, he gets that famous kill over the wall from water. Happens so many times, right? So factor these in when you are indeed playing at esportspools/esp.bet. So Danish Counter-Strike collectively is the best in the world. There's no country, there's no small region which really can compete with it, because they've got the three teams that would be in anyone's kind of top 15, top 20. They've got two teams in the top 10, arguably two teams in the top 5. So at the moment, no one can really fuck with Danish CS. So there's obvious value just immediately in saying, well, who is the best Danish player then? Because it's a category of its own, but it's quite a packed category. But I actually think in general, I do promote having the idea of these discussions around players from a region or a country, even when it's smaller ones, because I think it's just another marker that if you keep track of, by keeping track of all of them, you put together a bigger picture looking around the world of who the star players are and who the best players are and what the hierarchy of those players is. It's yet another marker to keep track of. So you can see how far is the second or third best player from being the best in their country or their region? How far up are they rising down the ladder? What would it take for this player to drop down? When you keep track of these markers, then when player performance fluctuates, you can just adjust them a little bit and you've already done most of the work. It's not like every time you start at zero and go, right, who would be the best player from that region? I'd have to go back and search it all. You've already got it kind of in place and you just tweak the parameters and you get your newest result. So then, once you've figured out the context of a country and region, then you can obviously factor them into the wider global context. And it has to be said, at the moment, yes, it seems unlikely that a Danish CS player is the best in the world, which is also why it's worth discussing who's just the best in Denmark. Because at the moment, we've got some pretty crazy players in the world. Actually, the superstar talent is really nuts right now. And then you add in teams who are winning and being successful. It's kind of hard to argue against coldzera, Nico, perhaps Kenny S. You know, Simple's very, very good, but Navi doesn't go very far at the moment, doesn't get as many chances to show it off. You know, there's some really elite level talent. Obviously, yes, I think Config and Device, I think they're definitely in the discussion, but I don't really know that anyone's putting them as number one right now because of how exceptional some of those others are and how good some of those other teams are as well. So when we have this discussion around who the best Danish player is, it's worth considering what the history of that kind of status or that title is, because for pretty much all of the last 3.5 years, the consensus has been, and I would say quite accurately, that Device has been the best Danish player. There have been periods when people contested him for that title, but over that period of time, he's by far the best Danish player, and pretty much all periods in that time, he still was the number one player from Denmark, still was the number one talent, and I think at times, actually, arguably has been briefly the best player in the world, or really battling with the Olaf Meisters and Guardian and Kenny S, and these sorts of players, obviously coldzera, Nico, for the title of best player in the world. So if you're already at that level, you can see that he was ahead of the other Danish players. But you go back to the beginning of CSGO, and funnily enough, the first great player that we actually had from Denmark was actually the player Nico, but with a C. He was the player who played for Western Wolves. He was the star AWPer. Glaive was his in-game leader. MSL was his support player. He had Pimp on his team. And this guy was very I wouldn't say it. Here's the thing. People did overrate to some degree how good he was. Like, I never thought he was as good as Kenny S and Guardian. I thought that was overrated. And he definitely actually had some qualities, I guess, a little bit in common with Device now. And that Device isn't the best AWPer in CSGO, but the way he's used within his team is very impressive. And that context makes him more impactful. So Nico was very good in the context of that very tactical Western Wolves team. But even then, it was mainly for sort of like 2 or 3 months he was very good, like spring to summer of 2013. Unfortunately, he had a lot of motivation issues and didn't practice very much. And as the game developed and other teams got better, we got more good teams. First of all, his team fractured apart anyway. And then he initially got his chance over in Copenhagen Wolves, which was actually the core that later on would become Astralis. But had Device was coming in and out of the lineup. The problem is that basically died off after 2013. And even though he played on for a couple of years more, and he played in Dignitas, which was the second best Danish team, his level really went badly. And so he was only really the best Danish player for a couple of months around the spring of 2013. Late 2013, coming into early 2014, it was very much open, actually. It was very much up for grabs. I mean, you could go around there and you could make a bunch of different cases. Like, Dupree was a very good player. Device was starting to emerge. It was still very young, by the way, at that point in time, and would have the odd performances, but also was in and out of the lineup at times. Zipnix was a good player and had developed from being a star to this, like, very good all-around player. Now we consider him sort of a support player. There was a lot of talent around at the time, but it helps that the Danish teams in general weren't that good. Like, at that point in time, Western Wolves had died out, and Copenhagen Wolves used to kind of come top 8 at most tournaments and get the odd upset map. You come into 2014 though, right? Early on, Cajun B was very good, which is how he got himself back into the squad, which then became Dignitas, but is now basically Astralis, essentially the core. He had his moments, but 2014, the clear 2 contenders are Device and Dupree. And these players were, it was the initial start of the double D combination becoming very good, and it was getting their teams to semi-finals at majors, making deep runs, obviously never making big finals, because famously that's a quality that they never used to be able to do under Fetish. Both were very good in their own rights. Dupree was a very good entry fragger in an era when his team wasn't very good on T-side. It was a very CT-sided dominant meta. So that tells you how good he was. That his team didn't get many T rounds, but he was considered one of the best entry fraggers in the world. And then Device already was showing off like superstar talent. Like, his raw skill and ability was clearly very good, and he was already quite refined in terms of skill and how he applied it. He wasn't just a mad aimer, although he definitely had very good aim. He was very polished though already. It's just that he still had his choking issues, but even so, up until semi-finals, he was an outrageously good player. So I would say Device probably just edges it there. And I'd say second half of 2014 onwards, I'd say Device is like slightly ahead in this category, but he only really embraces it and becomes the clear number one late 2014 going into 2015. And in 2015, it's clearly Device was the best Danish player. He helped TSM become this true rival to Fnatic, win big tournaments. He was having like MVP performances at some of these. Admittedly, he was in a very good team in terms of skill. I think that team, actually, when you look back now, in terms of skill and fitting their roles, I think that TSM team in 2015 is one of the best teams I've ever seen in Counter-Strike. Like, sometimes you have teams that are pretty good and have good, very good players in certain roles, but then their best player is so good he just carries the rest of them and they get the big wins. I don't think that was the case in this line. They were really good top to bottom, because obviously Zipnix had that period in the fall where they were going to cut him and they started playing outrageously. Obviously people remember Dubai most famously. Cajun was obviously one of the main reasons why they were so good on Dust 2, was able to help them out with his AWPing on other maps. So Device didn't have to AWP all the time. Dupree had his moments. Everyone remembers coming into Cluj-Napoca where he'd won all those clutch rounds. He was helping them win the PGL Season 1. He had his times where he was very good, but I think collectively over the whole year, the only one who was truly like superstar level was Device. I think by the time he got to late summer, early fall, I actually think there was a brief period where he took the title from Olaf Meister's best player when the Pronax era Fnatic was winding down before they made the Danish change. Yes, outside of TSM, who admittedly were very strong, you have to also give a little nod to AZ, because he had those solid like 4 or so months after MSL took over, which totally turned AZ's career around because of that dual entry core approach that MSL took. That really turned AZ into a star, and is how he got bought for FaZe. He was a good player at that point in FaZe, just the team wasn't very good. But really, those are 4 to 5 months, often not going this far in tournaments, often being like a carry on a team where, aside from Pimp and Kirby was very shaky and wasn't that good at that point in time, there wasn't a lot of firepower in that team. And I think he was... It's you can certainly look at his play and say it was exceptional, but he didn't have the full year like Device did, and also his team didn't really put him in position to be able to have enough matches to shine in the same way I think as Device did. So Device clearly in 2015, that was one of his first really dominant years, I thought. 2016, it's obviously Device the whole way, isn't it? Because even though Astralis was actually pretty bad for like the middle period, beyond like as soon as like the spring really got going, Astralis became terrible. They started to drop out in group stages or just make playoffs and then lose to NIP all the time, those sorts of results. But Device was fucking amazing. I mean, he was actually a beast even at that major where they had to go and play with Zonic and fucking Glaive as not as an in-game leader. He was just carrying him there, almost took him to the semis past Virtus.pro. People forget that matchup. So he was playing really well all of 2016, was having some hard carry performances even in losses. The only real person who can contend with him in 2016 is Magisk, because Magisk had those 4 or so months from like June to October when he finished up in SK. He had that E-League performance that was wild, and then he went over to what is now known as North, but was then Dignitas. And this guy was outrageous for those first few months. His numbers were a monster. He would get so many kills. He would so few deaths. He would win clutches. He would help you win maps like Mirage. It was really outrageous stuff. But that's 4 months. Device had the whole year. And obviously late in the year, they got Glaive. They became much better. And he continued to be very good and arguably was the best player in the world at the end of the year. So Device gets 2016. You come to 2016, right? The start of the year, Device was very good, especially at the major. Very, very good numbers. For the whole of the year, he's definitely been good and it's been up to his standard. Hasn't had as many crazy peaks, like one-off tournaments that are as nuts, but the standard's always there. He has had some shaky playoff series, especially the ones that Astralis lost. Admittedly, some of those are him going missing. He's actually sort of regained some of the flaws there to some degree. Then again, though, you look in the past, he was often playing with the rifle there. I think it's harder to offset some of his bad games because he's getting the open. He's trying to make that work so much. So in a sense, I don't mind that as much. He has also had some monster series, though. Now, here's the thing. Most of the time, it is against the lesser opposition. But I mean lesser as in, get anyone outside of the top 5 teams in the world and put Astralis against them. First of all, Astralis is probably going to win the series. And secondly, Device will usually not just do well, but go super ham. So if anything, that shows that the role and the style of how he's trying to play is exactly what he should be doing, because when they have an edge, it's mega effective. It's not just effective. Now, against the very elite teams, it might sound counterintuitive, but while, yes, I do think he goes missing in certain key maps and does choke to some degree, I also think a factor on certain maps like Overpass and Train is that people understand that he's such a key element to their attack, that especially when he's on CT side, people focus this guy. They really put it in that sense. So I think he has had some notably very good series, SK at Major. He has also had some really terrible series, though, in some finals and semis, which I think might have been an issue as to why they didn't win as many titles. But I think this year, he has had a very clear competitor, and the clear competitor is Config. Because over the year, he's been the strongest player for North pretty much the whole year. He's had really big tournaments, even when North hasn't won many tournaments. He's had really strong performances sometimes in losses. I actually think that he's been fantastic. Then you've got to consider as well, he's been playing the whole year, at times with a role swap, because obviously AZ took over the entry role mainly when he came to North. Config's having to be playing this weird off, like, semi-lurker role at times, or not quite in the entry core at times, which obviously set up in the MSL system to get that star who comes in second, tons of frags. He hasn't even been in that role, and his numbers are still fucking crazy. So I think Config's been very impressive overall. The final person I think's in the mix though for this conversation, because it's a 3-horse race in my opinion, is Dupree. Because Dupree had his issues early on with Glaive coming in. Because when Glaive came in, they swapped up Kirby's role to be more of an entry player. Kirby initially really succeeded from that. Dupree came in, he had to become what they call like the defensive star, defensive carry, whatever, but more of a lurker basically. And even though he's always been a good clutch round player, this did seem to hit him early on. He was already in not great form when they made the Karrigan swap for Glaive. And it's not that he struggled, he wasn't bad by any means, although he certainly had the odd bad tournament like Star Series, which I think he did cost them in the final there. But he had to adapt to this role. He played his whole career as an entry fragger, pretty much a playmaker, the star, and then they play off what he does. And especially because him and Device, if you look at their contrasting styles, Device was a much more defensive, more passive star, more play from the back star, and Dupree was more the aggressive playmaker in that respect. And so you have to adapt very much when you're playing off people, and then you're having to just make decisions later off that. But you're not the one initiating things and getting to necessarily decide how the matter's going to go, and having to play more within the supportive core of the team, which I do feel he did a good job. But here's the key thing. He embraced that role. He's absolutely changed his mind. He is that sort of player now. And now you see, from the summer onwards, he has really come on strong, and he's a really good player. He's one of the best at his role now in the world. He's one of the best in Astralis, and he contends with Device for best player in Astralis, and therefore best player in Denmark. So here's the thing, though. That's an overview of CSGO history, who was the best player in each year, and who were the best players overall. What we're going to ask, though, is the question is, who is the best Danish player right now? As in right this second. Now, when you ask about that, right, I want to make this quite clear. The idea is who is the best. Like, who is the one having the best overall performance right now? So we're talking about last 2 to 3 months. It's not who would you start a franchise with if you could go back in time. It's not who will be the best in the next 3 months or 2 years from now or over their whole career. It's not whose team will be the best or who fits their team the best. It's just who to play over the last couple of months. Who's played the best and performed the best, and therefore is at the moment the best Danish player. So let's start with Device, the traditional best player from Denmark. Right, you can still make a pretty good case for him as the best. First of all, he is so instrumental to what Astralis does that, while I'm not saying this in the context of who fits their team the best, but you see the impact he has on Astralis, because he doesn't just AWP when they have the money for that, he AWPs all the time it's possible. They save every AWP they can get for him. He saves when it's a bad situation. If he has the money, he's always going to have the AWP. Now, the reason why this is quite key to point out is he is still just a hybrid player. He's developed his game to be able to play with these superstar AWPers and have the AWP all the time. But that's actually amazing. I'm really impressed by that, because this is a guy where for most of his career, he had the rifle at least half the time and was an exceptional rifle player, by the way. Tomorrow, if the AWP was removed, like not from the game because it wouldn't be available, but Device for some reason couldn't buy an AWP, he would still be one of the best players in the world and would be exceptional and would win rounds and games in other ways, like more clutches, more just 1 to 2 frags per round. He has become a very good AWPer, but you have to acknowledge that he is AWPing all the time. And as such, he's having to live that tough life of a primary AWPer, where you can have massive games, you can have terrible games, where you didn't necessarily play as terribly as a rifle player, but because it's an AWP and you miss or people count your position, you're going to look bad on stats, on paper, but you're not going to look as bad if people actually look at the context of the round. So obviously, he is so instrumental to the big wins Astralis has against any of the top 5 teams. Typically, if he does badly, they lose the game. If he does very well, they have a pretty good chance to win those series. You've got to consider he plays a lot of LANs and a lot more series against the better teams than Config, for example. Config's team doesn't go as far. So you have to factor that in as well. Even though Device has some really bad semis and finals, North never made it to some of those. So it's hard to say that, well, you get, like, yeah, that's a minus to Device, but it's not a plus for Config, because Config essentially had 0 in those semis and finals. You didn't get there, right? That doesn't exactly work perfectly like that, but you have to at least consider those factors. I will say he's had mixed results in the big matches, but here's the thing. Device gets his stats for every tournament, no matter what. First of all, he is exceptional versus lesser players, and within that context, while they aren't all lesser players, as an interesting detail, look through history. Everyone knows famously that Virtus.pro are the NA killers, right? Not a lot of people realize this. Device is an NA killer. With the exception of that E-League Season 2 final, which I think played into the other storyline of his career of choking, this guy has torn up NA players when he plays them on LAN. He just fucking thrives against them. And even now, when we have some pretty good NA teams, Team Liquid, arguably the best NA team ever. Cloud9, pretty good fucking team. Top 10 team absolutely in the world. He wrecks these teams. He goes really fucking ham when he plays these guys. And especially any teams, basically, that are more than 1 or 2 spots below Device on the ranks, on the ladder, on his Astralis, that is, he just destroys these teams. And so he's so exceptionally good there. You can't just say, well, if you're the best player, we're only counting matches against the best. It doesn't really work that way. It is a very good factor if you do well against the best, but actually being the best player is how you play against everyone. And so his overall level is very good just off that. I will say his recent numbers and strength, I do think have actually been helped. And this is a factor as to why I think he can be the number 1 player in the next few months, actually, is that I think that them actually moving back to train as a pick is emphasizing him more. Because even though people know he had a key role on Astralis, he was a lot more up and down in terms of how well he did there. And by the way, as a secondary detail, that's a very strong map for Dupree historically, and especially recently when he's come on strong. But Device was having his issues there sometimes as people have studied that map and how he plays, because Astralis had such an exceptional win rate on it this year. But as they've moved back to train, on both sides of the map, Device is so key. He's so key at those those big rounds where he comes in second or third outside on train. Obviously, they wait for the first 30 seconds on T side on train anyway to let him get those pickoffs from like the middle area. Then on CT side, he's absolutely the most important player they have in the team. And you see he has those huge carry performances. So with Train being their main pick at the moment, the map they're going to play a lot more because very few people ban it, that's a very good chance for not only for his recent results to go up, as they have, but also for him to potentially be better in the future. Now then, when we come over, and by the way, good on both sides there. One of the issues I see on Overpass is he's a lot more of a double-edged sword approach because he does take those aggressive duels with the AWPers when he's on T side because he scouts them and tries to go for those. Problem with those is just as they're going to work for you and you're going to directly counter a guy and just kill him when you know where he is and scout it correctly, the times it doesn't work and the times that they have the counter to what they've seen you doing or you just outright missed the shot, you're just going to die and it looks like you had no impact on the scoreboard. So it can be quite key there. And the fact that Astralis in general is having, I wouldn't say massive issues, but some issues against the elite teams on that map, and they're going away from it. I think that actually will boost him, but has been one of the reasons why he's had his issues recently. Now let's look at Config. So Config, stats-wise, very impressive. Really great stuff. Not always the highest numbers, but when you consider the role and his style of play, I think these are very high numbers. These are very good. In the context of how aggressive he is, how duel-heavy, how aim-heavy his style of players, how he will just take duels without necessarily needing utility or someone to put him in position. To have such good stats and consistently is very impressive. It is actually akin and reminiscent to me of Fur's stats in the summer when Fur was absolutely an MVP candidate. But the difference was he didn't do it because of the system, people playing off him. He was very aggressive and he was enabling the system. I think that's what Config does to some degree in North. He's a very impressive player. Now, I also think it's quite key to note that while he doesn't get to as many big semis and finals as Device, he's actually pretty good in general in losses. Like, one of the key things about Config is he can have a bad game or an average game in a big loss, but he doesn't ever seem to actually crumble. This is something I noticed last year when Magisk looked like the best player in North, and him and Magisk were like the star core duo. I remember watching, and the difference was Magisk was a very good all-around player, but sometimes would have that map that was just terrible. Config in general, he can have a bad map, because obviously when you play such an aim-heavy style, you can have games where your aim's off, or you're taking really bad fights. But generally, he doesn't ever seem to mentally crumble. So that's actually very interesting, not just now for being a factor as to why he's one of the best, if not the best, but when you're going forwards and you're considering how he's going to hold up beyond this. I also think that that comes from his confidence. Now, it shows in interviews his cockiness, because he plays it up. He is quite clearly a cocky person, by the way. But I do think behind the cockiness, some people are cocky, by the way, when they're trying to like portray an image, project an image of strength, because actually they're weak, and that's like their way to counter it. I think his confidence is real, and I think it's genuinely grounded in his skill set, how good he is, and the things he can do in the game, and the knowledge that he can do those things. And by the way, that he's better than some of the players in teams that are beating his team and are winning the trophies. So of course he's like, well, I'm fucking better than these guys. Of course we can win this match. Like, give me all my spots, let me do what I want to do, and I'll go to work. So that's a very good sign when you're talking about a best player, because it's already showing you that it's legit, these results now, and that it can be legit in the future. So I think in terms of skill, I think Config probably wins right now. I think the impact he's showing in his performance is outrageous. The other person I put in the mix, but when I say it, this is more like the nod. Like, you get the, usually we call it honourable mention, right? So I don't think Dupree can really be made the case that he is number one, but I think you can make a strong case that he's not far off these other two, that you have to mention him right now. Because as I said before in kind of the preamble, his impact went up a lot, not just in stats, but in how he wins rounds and games for the team in the summer and since then. Now, one thing I find is interesting that I'm having investigated at the moment is his rise seems to have actually paired with Kirby's drop. Now, funnily enough, obviously Kirby's initial rise was while Dupree wasn't doing that well, but that was because they had a harsh role swap and Kirby's played a lot of his career as an entry fragger. As Kirby's fallen off and Dupree's level's gone up, I wonder what the connection there is, because obviously he's getting put in a lot more situations where he has to win out a clutch, where they haven't just broken a site wide open. I also think, actually, funnily enough, that the strength of the team on Overpass and sticking with it as a pick has helped his numbers a lot, because he is so exceptional on that map. I mean, first of all, played it his entire career. Obviously, Australia's teams have always been good on it with Carrigan, with Glaive. But people know it's no joke. Every time he plays Overpass, it feels like he gets 1 to 2 of those ridiculous kills where people do the boost and he kills them. Like, generally, there's just something about that map and that B site that he just feels so comfortable. His timing and his intuitive sense for where to be and what to do are just absolutely phenomenal. And funnily enough, that didn't get affected because obviously you go so slow on that site anyway. You don't always, unless you do a B rush, you still might rush to that area and then just hold on it. That somehow the fact he got put in a more of a lurking defensive carry role didn't affect his ability to do those things within the context of then switching to his role still, because often he'll hold there while they're pushing onto A very slowly. So I think that one of the things that would put Dupree forwards as a potential candidate for best Danish player is, in terms of an all-around talent, this guy might be number one at the moment. I mean, Device, certainly with his AWPing, you have to say he's got a very special all-around talent. Config's more of a, not one-dimensional, but more of a focused, narrow type of ability and performance, but exceptional in that regard. But I think in terms of all-around talent, Dupree is really up there right now because we know his pistols. Obviously, his Deagle is world famous and naturally should be. He's a very good player on both sides of the maps. Like, actually, I think his CT side on Train and Overpass has been a big factor in why they've been so good on those maps. He has a number of maps he is a very good player on. He's a famous clutch round player. I think he still does that to some degree. Obviously, people think more of Zipnik's in his team. But you can see he does it across the board. And by the way, in this team, a criticism of Astralis, quite rightly, has been, since they don't have Cage and B anymore, they only have Devices and AWP. And Device is forced to AWP all the time to make this tactical style work, because obviously a tactical team is going to be better with an AWP tool to use on a regular basis. But they've been using Dupree as a secondary AWPer recently. And I have to say, he's been pretty decent, actually. It just showed me that this is a guy who he is just talented, and he knows how to work at it as a professional. So he takes his talent, and he refines it, and he develops it, and he doesn't do it with massive fanfare or people having to give him praise and all that stuff. He just works at trying to make himself better within the context of his team system to make his team better so his team has a chance to win. That's what you want from a star player. That's what you want from an all-time great player. Not necessarily that they just do the one thing they're good at and win the game from that, although that is certainly a viable, valid option if you are the number one option on your team. So, again, a thing that's impressive about Dupree is embracing all these aspects that weren't what identified him in the past as a very good player and becoming very good almost as a new type of player, just as Device has become good as this new type of player as an AWPer. So I think generally you have to just look at the breadth of what Dupree's doing and say, very impressive, and certainly let's put him in this conversation. Now, I haven't included any in-game leaders here because, first of all, I certainly think MSL and Carrigan and Glaive all are actually contenders for best in-game leader in the world in their own way. I mean, I think MSL's pick ban cripples him a little bit there, but he's so good in other respects on gun rounds. I would say, though, that at the moment, since none of them are the best in-game leader, or it's debatable if they are, it's just too tough to figure out where in-game leaders fit in with best player. And I think traditionally best player should be best performing player anyway, not just overall impact, because impact becomes a very vague term anyway. So actually, right now, I think of these three, for me it goes like this. I think it's clearly between Device and Config. I think Dupree is a respectable third, but I think those other two outmatch him in many respects. And personally at the moment, just for right this second, I'll edge it to Config. I've thought for the last couple of months he looked like he was the best. Just North had to get in a position again where they were making deep runs, getting deep in tournaments, because before they weren't even making playoffs sometimes, or they make playoff and go out first round against anyone. At the moment, they're getting good, they're getting to semis, they can potentially win tournaments. He's one of the main reasons why, if not the reason, because they've got a very good team top to bottom in terms of overall ability, and they fit their roles pretty well, and they're a good team, but he's the reason why they have the chance potentially to win tournaments, because he actually alone can be the best player in the server pretty much almost every time, unless he's maybe facing Cold Zero or Nico or Kenny S. He's probably going to be the best player in the server whenever North plays anyone. So a very, very strong player. I think Device is a close second. I think he has his own qualities going for him. I think map issues at the moment in that team are affecting him. I think having some crumbles later in big tournaments is hitting him a little bit. I don't think he's quite at his career peak, though he's still a very good and a very impactful player and a decisive player, key player for Astralis. And I think Dupree's a respectable third, who I thought should just be mentioned at this point in time, because he certainly deserves it in terms of accomplishment. And I think you have to mention him to point out the things he does, to then see the contrast as to where the others are superstar players, whereas he's more of a star player right now. And I think it's quite cool that he's become a star player again. You've got that double D combo, and it wasn't just like it was before, where Device is the overall star. The rest are like very good and do it by committee almost as a second star, like Zipniks and Clutches. Dupree was just learning his role and eventually became a good defensive carry. Kirby was a good entry fragger and pretty good player in big matches sometimes. Now they've got more the clear 2 stars, and I think that's actually taken some of the pressure off Kirby, who's been having ailing performances, and given him a bit of breathing room where they can decide, can they rework him into being a better player in his role, or do they need to replace him perhaps with, and this is something exciting for the future as a little final detail, the obvious roster move you'd make if you had to make one now to make the best Danish team probably is to take out Kirby and to put Config in, because in theory they play similar roles, or could at their prime, and Config's a better version of it and a much more skilled player. Plus you think to yourself, imagine if you had these 3 players, who I'm talking about, Device, Config and Dupree, in one team. Now yes, it'd be a lot for Glaive to deal with. You'd absolutely have to, I think, assign a lot of resources to Config and play around him a lot, but fucking hell, you could also do a lot. Now, with that said, it could certainly disrupt the style that Astralis has, where everyone's on the same page and they know what their limits are and then how to play to help their teammates. That's something we can't necessarily know yet how Config would up there, but certainly an interesting thought that these 3 players could all be on the same team at some point in the future. But at the moment, I actually am going to dethrone Device briefly. And I'm going to say that right now, for this moment, Config is the best Danish player in CS.
I'm Device from Astralis, and welcome to Thorin's YouTube channel. It's a joke-free zone.